Looking back, the transition from Following to Memento, seemed very natural at the time. I can't really remember the detail. I remember actually going to LA for a holiday and staying with Chris and Emma, sometime before production and reading an early draft of the script, and just chatting about the next project. And so when it actually went into production, it just seemed a very natural progression. The one thing I would say, just looking at the trajectory from Following to Memento, I wasn't really thinking about it at the time. I wasn't thinking about the grand picture of where this is leading me. I was just enjoying the fact that I was working on music and someone was paying me to do so. In some ways, the script to Memento was probably harder to read than the film is to watch. Obviously the script had all the descriptions of colour and black and white scenes, but you had to probably keep more in your head. Because while watching it, you're not going to forget you're watching a colour or black and white scene. But when reading the script, you definitely had to pay attention. With Memento, it was slightly unusual in that I did start writing music to the script. So I'd had some conversations with Chris about music ideas he wanted, where he'd given me a few very, very specific pointers. I remember he wanted a simple 3 or 4 note theme. I remember he wanted a high-pitched feedback sound. I'm sure there were other things he requested. But in film production, it's quite normal for the composer to come on later in the day during the edit. So the first time I'll see a film, it'll be covered with what's called temporary music, basically other people's music from last year's blockbuster, and that sort of thing. And if you speak to composers, we all have a love-hate relationship with temp music. And Chris certainly never wanted to use temp music. On all the projects we worked for, we didn't use temp, so I would always start writing to the script. And I think I wrote him five pieces of music, which I sent over, and of those 5 pieces, one became the basis of the Derelict theme, one became the Motel Room theme, and then one piece, as I remember it, is in the film note for note as the demo. The advantage of this process to both me and Chris was we didn't have to rely on temp music. So while Chris was editing, he's putting my first drafts and my demos into the film. So it's not a case of having to replace someone else's music. It's a case of having to refine my demos, make them work to picture, explore new ideas. So in a way, we were able to have what's called temp love. We were able to love the temp score because it was the score. When working with that temp, I think you do need a director with a level of imagination who can work to music that's not written to picture and manipulate it in their own way and do things with it. I mean, to me, the key example in Memento, reading the script, there's the sequences where Sammy Jankis is having his psychological tests and he's picking up the objects that are electrified. And I wrote this piece of music with the high feedback sound Chris wanted and this repetitive piano note running through it. And I just assumed this was, I can't even remember what I called the demo, I might have called it Sammy's test. It was written for that scene. And then when I got the next cut of Memento back, Chris had put it, I think note for note, into the scene where Leonard first looks at his tattoos, at the facts. And that was a really interesting form of collaboration. I could write a music for one scene in my head, and then Chris could do something different with it that was actually more appropriate. And then you look back now at the Sammy scenes and they have no music on them. I think, in terms of writing to script versus writing to picture, it depends on the film, it depends on the director. And I think it's got to be someone, again, where you've got a good relationship and a shorthand with them. But ultimately, writing to picture is what you've got to do. So you don't want to go down too many blind alleyways. But, I think with my work with Chris, it was a case of, here's an idea, it might not be right. And if it's someone you trust enough to throw, and you don't mind an idea being thrown out, I think that works. But it can be tricky when you don't have that relationship, and it's harder to then say, oh, here's an idea, you may or may not like it.
It's time for my shot.
The fractured timeline of Memento did have an impact on the music. And the first very obvious impact is, Chris had specifically said that he wanted, the colour sequences and the black and white sequences to have very different music, to just help reinforce in people's minds that these were different elements of the film. Comparing the two, the colour sequences are based more around a string sound, albeit a synthesized string sound. And then the black and white sequences are more abstract. And that was sort of a deliberate element on my part. We used an electronic score because Chris wanted the film to still have a slightly abstract, disjointed feel. So, synthesizers suited that quite well. But within the electronic score, basing the colour sequences on a string sound, although it's a synthesized sound, it still relates in people's heads to a real instrument. If you use a piano sound or strings, then maybe on a psychological level people can connect that to a real instrument. So in the motel room, by having the synthesizer sounds more abstract, it's harder to relate them to a real instrument. You don't hear these sounds and think, oh, that's being played by a flute, whatever. So hopefully that gives you a slightly more disjointed feel to them. Actually, we did a similar thing with the bruised sounds in Following. Well, it's interesting, in preparation for this, I, watched the two films back to back for the first time in quite a few years. And, I never really thought about it for how the similarities between some of them, the way we use music to help emphasize the fractured timeline, the way they're both, but in their different ways, very different budgets and very different productions, but they're still both quite contained films, really just about three central characters. I know people have described the music to Memento as having a melancholy running through it. I'm not sure that's the right word. I was trying to infuse it with a sense of loss, but a very sort of specific sense of loss, because Leonard's lost something, but at the same time, he doesn't really know what he's lost. Obviously, he knows about his wife and his past life, but because he's this unreliable narrator, we can't really get to grip with his emotion. So I quite like that slightly, the way he's set adrift in the modern world. There's sequences when I quite like, especially music, is when he's burning his wife's possessions. It's like he's trying to remember this thing and he's got this tie to the past, but in terms of the emotion behind the score to Memento, I think it just arose out of the film and the images in the script. And, knowing that we needed to ground the audience in some manner, because, the film is tricky to follow, but you need a grounding somewhere. And even in a slightly abstract sense, Leonard's emotions and his loss is what we pin it on. But I think I've said before, I always view the entire film as Leonard's theme, because the film is central to him.
Ouch.
Now, the first time I saw Memento with an audience was at the Toronto Film Festival. And it was great to see an audience react, but also great to come out and hear that sort of audience reaction of, what happened there? I need to go and see it again. Which, as the composer, in a way, I'm slightly denied, because by that point I'd seen the film so many times. I'd love to have been able to go to see it as a one-off, completely cold. You come out of the screening and someone turns to you and say, oh, you really need to see that film a second time. So, I've already seen it about 100 times. There's lots of parts of Memento But one of the things, when you score a film, when you might have watched it 100 times, you sort of generate a different relationship to it. But one scene I always loved was in the motel room, where Leonard's on the phone and he's scratching at a plaster on his arm, and he just suddenly pulls it off and never answers the phone. And that still impacts me every time I've seen it. But it's just such a great reveal of how his whole sort of system should be working but isn't really working. And although the Sammy Jankis scenes I refer to as having no music, there is a piece of music, for the death of his wife, which is actually one of my favourite pieces in the film. I mean, one of the things, Chris is often quite specific about is sounds and stuff he wants. And one of the things he asked for was a high-pitched feedback. Now, I made this by taking, various guitar effects, pedals and reverbs, and actually setting them up on the mixing desk so they were feeding back on each other. So there was no instrument involved. And it's quite a fun process, which I still use this day for sound design. You're mixing the fade, you're tweaking the faders, and you go between nothing happening and uncontrollable noise. And between the two, there's a sweet spot. And there's this one of the original pieces I wrote for Chris to the script was a couple of guitar pedals set up, and then on the keyboard I was literally improvising in one or two notes, and it made this wonderful swirling effect. And this was just recorded straight to DAT tape, digital tape. I had this improvised piece to DAT tape. Chris loved it. And then as I went on to the next stage of writing the picture, I was moving over to recording directly onto hard disk rather than digital tape, which gave me more, by doing hard disk recording, it was easier to work to picture, and I could manipulate the sound more and edit it and so forth. When I came to recreate this sound, despite noting everything, I could never get it exactly the same. And I think the reality was one of the guitar pedals had a flat battery in it at the time. And when I replaced that battery with a new battery, it just completely changed the setup. But by this point, Chris was in love with the sound, and I had to use that sound. So I had to digitize the original tape, and all of those pieces are just music edits and cuts of the original improvisation. But you see it quite early on in the film. Because in the first 5 minutes of the film, we get quite a lot. First 5-10 minutes, we probably get all the music, all the main themes, the opening titles, and into Teddy being killed. And when it goes from the string theme to the slightly weird synth sounds and repetitive piano notes at the end, where just before Teddy's shot, that's the piece that was edited from the flat battery guitar pedal. And that sounds actually also on the Never Answer the Phone tattoo.
You think you're supposed to recognize somebody? You just pretend to. You bluff it to get a pat on the head from the doctors. You bluff it to seem less of a freak.
I initially was writing to the script and then sent Chris these pieces. And I think the first time I then saw the picture was when the VHS came back to me. Well, this one's actually 27th of October 1999, and it's just reels 1, 2 and 3 of Memento, so the first half of the film in a rough cut, with these rough pieces of my music serving as a temp. And that's one of the interesting things, looking back at that period in music technology. Both those films were scored to VHS. Now I'd work to QuickTime files, which are much more convenient than having to fast forward back and forth between scenes. But it's interesting, that different way of working. And it's not that I miss it, because I don't miss it. But it was interesting because it probably does give you different thinking time. Well, it's interesting that the time that both Following and Memento were made, it was an interesting time in music technology. Stuff was, throughout all the history of music technology, it does seem to generally be about stuff becoming more affordable. But following was pretty much all sequenced in MIDI, direct to DAT tape, whereas by Memento I'd moved on to hard disk recording, which gives you a lot more flexibility to working to picture and a lot more flexibility to edit to the music. But they were both done to VHS tape, which is history in itself now. And also, at the time, my setup was quite limited, and they were both films were pretty much sort of scored on just 2 synthesizers. But I actually quite like that, and to this day, I still often like to set myself a limitation, because anyone who follows music technology will realise now you can, on a laptop or a phone, have access to so much. I think those limitations can be good for focusing the mind, so that I'm thinking maybe about the themes and emotion rather than being distracted by what the technology can produce. And I've got to use my limited resources to eke out everything I can from them. Those early synths are still the ones I can program the sounds the best from.
I have to believe in a world outside my own mind. I have to believe that my actions still have meaning, even if I can't remember them. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still there.
I mean, I've been looking back on the film. It's so hard with hindsight and this period of time to say what I remembered, about the film. For me, as a composer, my focus really is just on serving the film, making the music work. In a way, I'm not trying to worry about what happens to the film once I'm done with it. So it has been a huge pleasure to see, Memento do so well and resonate with people, and it's pass the test of time and still be an interesting film now.